Very important. Very important. All right. So today's guest is probably the tallest professor I've had at UCR, easily one of the sharpest. Dr. Demetrius Lewis is an assistant professor of management here at UC Riverside, and he's also held a faculty position at Emory's Goizueta Business School. His research lives at the intersection of networks, strategy, and social dynamics, basically how who you know shapes what you can do. From venture capital decision making to political entrepreneurship, his work explores how status, relationships, and uncertainty collide to influence real world outcomes. He's a Stanford PhD, a Princeton grad, and the kind of academic who makes you think twice about how deals get made behind the scenes. So we're diving into homophily, co-investment strategy, and why sometimes being on the edge of the network might be the best place to be. Thank you for being here, Dr. Lewis.
My pleasure. Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm super excited to have this conversation.
Yeah, of course. That was a very lengthy introduction, but sometimes we need that for very accomplished
Some
individuals.
foundation, yeah.
So I went into your Google Scholar. I was mentioning this earlier. And I went through every single title of your research. I didn't actually get to every single publication.
Sure.
But I also wasn't able to read through the articles. I was just able to read the abstract and the title.
Yeah.
And based on those two things, I was like, this is enough for me to have a conversation.
Okay, great. I'm
So-
glad it was informative enough to make sense.
No, it is. Actually, not just informative enough, just the titles in of themselves.
Great.
It's not informative, but they're informative.
Mhm.
But it makes me think how funny it is that you have to be so eloquent with your titles. Because you need to be able to say a
Sure.
lot in
Yeah,
a little.
Very little bit. Yeah, exactly.
And as an example, let me read off the first publication
Sure.
we want to talk about. So, micro-level homophily as a macro-level feedback loop. I kid you not, I had to look up what homophily is. But could you give us a little description of what that title entails?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think, yeah, you've caught on to that. This is our version of the kind of 10-second elevator pitch, right? Where
Yeah.
you have to be able to describe yourself in a very kind of concise manner. This is the toughest when I was on the academic job market because you write a dissertation for 3, 4, maybe even more years. And this is a culmination of everything you do during your PhD. And then when you go out to do not even interviews, but to network with people that are hiring and recruiting for university academic positions, you have to distill that years of work down into a sentence or two that you can tell to someone in passing that it's going to pique their interest, and then hopefully you're able to have a follow-up conversation after that. But it's really hard, I think, polishing and distilling what it is that you do into a way that's captivating, but also it captures the work that you've done, expresses it in a coherent way.
No, definitely.
Yeah.
And I feel like that title does a really good job, at least, of explaining what the abstract is.
Yeah.
Once you understand what each word means.
Exactly. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So for this paper, the background for how we got into this research was about trying to understand, delving beyond the sort of organizational level focus on social capital and venture capital network. Lots of people have studied networks in venture capital, looking at how co-investment relationships between venture capital firms influence performance outcomes like IPOs and what kinds of deals they invest in and things like that. We were able to take advantage of this really rich individual level data to take a more almost micro level perspective, as you see in the title, where we're actually able to look at individuals' decision making in terms of the types of investments and the types of profiles and demographics of entrepreneurs that investors decided to fund. And so there's some research that looks at the individual level, trying to understand how different types of social characteristics of investors influence these co-investment relationships among other investors. So who would you decide to join an investment with? There was less research on the entrepreneur-investor divide. So basically how those types of social characteristics related to investors deciding whether or not to fund an entrepreneur's startup or not, and then how that relates to the different investment outcomes that the startup might achieve. We were interested in that individual level, but then we also thought, I wonder if we can take this one step further to actually then zoom out and try to understand how those individual level decisions aggregate to the market level and how they actually influence then the types of startups and the types of entrepreneurs that are advantaged and are able to remain in the market to compete for funding. And so what I mean by that is that there seems to be a strong preference among investors to fund startups with entrepreneurs with whom they share some social characteristic. This can be things like ethnicity, gender, geographic location, and very robustly in our results, co-location within the investor entrepreneur network, meaning that if I have a co-investment tie with another investor and that investor has worked with the entrepreneur previously in some fashion, I am much, much more likely to then fund the startup of that entrepreneur. And so that's our kind of micro level result where these things that are potentially related to quality, but not directly related to quality of the startup are the things that are actually driving these funding decisions. So not necessarily have I demonstrated that I have this technical proficiency or background from running a biomedical startup, but more did we attend the same MBA. And so what happens is that this ends up at a market level crowding out entrepreneurs that would have really good high quality ideas, but don't have those social connections or don't have these shared characteristics to be able to signal and then compete for funding. And so entrepreneurs that would otherwise be able to be funded for their great ideas either aren't looking for funding anymore or they're just not receiving the funding from those investors. So it's pushing them out of the market, which is making the market more homogeneous over time in terms of who's able to compete for that.
100%.
So then you end up having a market that's highly dominated by the kind of majority's kind of dominant characteristics, and there's not as much diversity. And in particular industries where these decisions based on homophily or that attraction to shared characteristics seem to be more prevalent. And this is, I think, so I've had conversations with industry professionals about this, some, in fact, former students of mine that have worked both on the investor as well as the entrepreneur side of this. And so one that is running a fairly large, successful fund now came to me and said, gosh, I really need to talk to you about this because this isn't, I remember you mentioned that your research was on this topic, actually encountering this problem now that we're trying to raise funds for our next funding round. And so what they said was that an issue that they were encountering was that limited partners had a very kind of strict set of expectations for what they expected a venture capital investor's portfolio investments to look like and who the entrepreneurs that were running these startups expected to look like as well. And so he had this sense, I feel we're leaving a huge amount of alpha, a huge amount of potential returns on the table because we're not able or we're not given the freedom to pursue these deals that are outside of this comfortable or more familiar network that the limited partners are used to. And when you're getting these deals that are inside this more familiar network, they could potentially be lower quality, right? Because you're not optimizing on just the business idea itself. And they're often already scooped in the sense that lots of people are exposed to these deals, are getting passed around, and you're not going to get the best equity terms. You're not getting it that kind of first opportunity to take a look at this, to develop it from scratch, and then get all the returns from it. And they said, this seems like it's actually limiting the ceiling of our return.
Yeah.
And so it's reducing our risk in the sense that, okay, we know these people, they're not going to run off with our money, but we're venture capitalists. We want to be taking risks. We want to be funding innovative startups. We want to be looking for that next generation, that next wave of disruptive technologies. And that's often going to come from outside of what we're familiar with. And so if we had the freedom to actually search more widely, search more aggressively in these kind of unscooped or untapped parts of the market, we would find, sure, some of these companies would fail, but this is where also we think the unicorns are going to be because of that wider variance that we're able to then take advantage of and then experience that ceiling of those really high performing companies out there. And we get the added benefit of being the first people tapping into this area where we can then be the market leader. We can be the dominant player in this space.
Interesting.
And so I said, great, I'm glad that you've identified this as a problem. I prepared some slides that he said, all right, I'm taking this into my next pitch meeting with our partners. Hopefully they'll agree with us and we can raise this fund and do with it what we want to. So it's unfortunate that this seems to be prevalent in industry as well, but it's encouraging that some industry practitioners are becoming aware that this is an issue and trying to find ways to counteract this problem.
100%. And this specific topic called to me because last summer, I think I mentioned it. I interned at a venture capital firm and I helped them with some research.
Yeah.
And I found a lot of data points, specifically demographic data points. I actually collected this by myself.
Wow, that's
It was
amazing.
it was so hard. But essentially, I looked at the LA County landscape in terms of startup founders and startup investors
Okay.
from VCs, accelerators, angels, etc., family offices, whatnot.
Mhm.
And I actually found that
Yeah.
exact discrepancy is what I noticed. The first data point that came out was 60 something percent of founders are white, and then you have a very fragmented portion of the LA County population between Latino and Black founders. I think they oscillate between 10 to 15% of founders
Wow.
in LA, which is disproportionate to what the actual population of LA is.
Yeah, that's right.
And then you look into the investor side of things, and it mirrors exactly
Yep.
the fragmentation. So I found that very interesting while I was doing my research, and then I read this publication. I was like, oh, wait, it's backed by academia.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. So now my follow-up to this is,
Yes.
do you believe that investors are aware of this? And you mentioned one example. Is this something that people are generally aware of? Because for more context,
Yeah.
one of the things that I would do for the VC was due diligence. So we had a lot of inbound startups send in their pitch decks, and I would see the exact same thing all the time.
Yeah.
So the founding team always comes from an Ivy League. The founding team has a specific set of criteria demographically
Yep.
that they all share amongst each other,
Yeah.
whether it be where they came from or whatnot. And usually those were the ones that were paid attention most to, regardless of the startup idea that it was. It was mainly, do they have credibility, and what are we looking for in terms of credibility? It is the Ivy Leagues. It is, have they been in VC before?
Yeah.
It is, have they founded a company before?
Exactly.
Those were the three most prevalent things that would happen. So do you feel like investors are aware of this and they
Yeah.
just follow suit?
This is a great question. So I think that investors think about like two different kinds of risk that they encounter. So one is risk related to horse, like the underlying business model, market fit, and the other one is risk about the jockey. So the jockey is the founding team, the lead, say, entrepreneur that's running the. And so if you ask VCs about what characteristics they pay attention to the most when they're making a decision about whether to fund a startup or not, I think 70 to 80% would say we really care. Like, it's all about the business model. It's all about product market fit. We just need to make sure. They said, we can always replace the founder. We can always do blah, blah, blah later on. And it's really just about whether or not this is a solid business idea and can we grow it, scale it, monetize it. Right? So this is what they say if you ask them like in a survey response, but then what they do in practice is very different, where something like 80 to 85% of startups that were founded among the same sample had some kind of pre-existing social tie to it. So this might have been, we went to the same school, we have familial ties, something like that. And so they say it's about the horse, but they always somehow know the jockey. There's some kind of familiarity that is clearly influencing their decision to actually work with people. I don't know. Is this a subconscious thing? Is it something that's just automatic? I think as humans, we gravitate towards what is similar and what is familiar. And this is a kind of uncertainty reduction where you have this kind of asymmetry of information between the investor and the entrepreneur, where really the entrepreneur is the only one that knows the actual quality of the startup. The only one that knows how hard are they working? Are they using the money properly that they were invested in? And so I think there's this natural tendency for people to try to reduce that kind of uncertainty by working with people that they know, figuring my friends and family to try to cheat.
100%.
Right? And so I think that consciously they'll say, like, I'm a person, I'm technically savvy. Of course, I'm going to pay attention to these technical indicators. I'm going to do some math and make some projections. But I think in practice, often a lot of these human instincts are the ones that really take.
And that's something that was reinforced as I was doing my internship. Funny thing about my internship, it was a 3-month internship with the firm.
Okay.
But 3 months prior to that, I was actually working with Pledge LA. It's a sub-branch of Annenberg Tech. And they brought in some VCs to basically teach us the VC fundamentals.
Yeah.
That is actually something that they discussed.
That's very cool.
How in order to do deals, you do have to pay attention to the horse, of course, but honestly, what it comes down to is the jockey is very important. So knowing who's doing it, knowing having a relationship based off trust on the entrepreneur is really what helps these startups get funded.
Yeah.
Which was it doesn't feel like it should be correct, but it makes sense because it even thinking about what we learned here at UCR, we get the idea of networking
Yeah.
reinforced all the time.
Oh yeah.
We get pushed to network in all business schools, not just UCR, but everywhere else. The point is go out, network, meet other people. And usually that's who you end up making deals with,
Absolutely.
which, as we see, the data shows that it gets reinforced in the real world, which is a little sad, I guess.
It is, but it's so prevalent. So even outside of the investment realm, there was this study done back in the 1970s, I believe, by Mark Granovetter, tried to understand how do people get jobs. So it's this wide scale study where he went out, mapped out a bunch of networks and tried to get a sense of how are people actually finding their employment. And so what he found was that like, the numbers are very similar. Something like 80% of all
Oh my
employment
God.
starts with some kind of pre-existing connection. So you're not cold calling recruiters and getting a job this way. Someone, you get a referral or a friend or somebody tells you about a position, and that's how you eventually find it. The interesting twist on that work was that he found that it wasn't your close friends that were actually the ones that were providing you with this kind of more robust information, more diverse information about getting a job. It was what he called weak ties. Not weak in the sense that very not a big relationship with them, but they're people that were connected to you, but in a little bit further away. So they're not in your very kind of tight, close-knit friend group, but people that may be an acquaintance that you keep in touch with every now and then, or professional connection. Similarly, and the idea was that these weak ties were providing you with new information that was non-redundant to the information that you were already getting from that close-knit friend. Basically, that your friend finds out about an opportunity because you're in the same kind of network position, the same kind of social context as this person, you're likely getting exposed to information about these opportunities both at the same time. So that information is going to be new. However, that person coming from a little bit further away in terms of their social context is going to have non-overlapping new information that then you could take advantage of to try to go out and get that job. And so it was this idea of having this combination of really close friends that you can trust them, they're going to be there for you, they're going to have your back, like that, but also making sure that you're diversifying your network outside of that close-knit group to have different kinds of social capital with different people and situations. So that could be different geographically in different regions, different age groups as well, different cultural backgrounds, different industry backgrounds, things like that. Because when new opportunities arise, whether jobs, investments, or anything else, that's where the new information is going to come from outside of your inner circle. And that's maintaining those connections is a way that you're in the best position to be able to take advantage of those opportunities.
So basically staying at the edge of the network.
Yeah, or balancing.
Balancing,
I think.
okay.
Yeah, having both these very strong ties as well as weaker ties that you can diversify the type of information and type of social you're able to take.
Yeah, I feel like that ties very well into that second publication that I found of yours. I think this was your dissertation, if I'm not mistaken. The one titled Co-Investment and Competition, the Strategic Networks of Venture Capital
That's
Firms.
right.
So I read the abstract and then wrote like a one sentence thing and seeing if I understood what it was talking about. Please correct me if I'm wrong and then help me tie it with what we've been talking about.
Yeah, absolutely.
But essentially in your dissertation, you explained that the way that VC firms build, enter, and move through co-investment networks shapes their access to opportunity, with strong ties and network position influencing not just performance, but the kind of risks and rewards that they're able to pursue.
Yeah. It's exactly about this point that having this kind of strong set of ties is helpful for providing you getting access to a high volume.
Okay.
But as we were talking about before, it's not necessarily the most interesting or the most innovative.
Because they're redundant.
Exactly. And so to really be on the cutting edge of that kind of innovative sphere, those disruptive technologies, it's necessary to build bridges outside of that really close to your group. And probe other parts of the network, other parts of the market, and then use your position as a bridge between your kind of close-knit social capital and these new opportunities to then really elevate yourself and take advantage of those new deals. So again, it's about this kind of balancing approach with social capital, not having too much of one kind the other, that is going to allow you to be the most successful overall in the market.
And going back to awareness from our investors,
Yeah.
are they aware of this? Are they conscious of these types of dynamics?
I think that most investors would think about their relationships definitely as a kind of longer term, repeated shot game where they're concerned about things like reciprocity, doing favors for people. These favors can also be constricting, where if I do something, if I have a good relationship with someone, but then I'm not able to, say, pursue really the investment strategy that I want because of norms of the group, because of the kind of need to coordinate a bunch of individuals, the need to make decisions that are about social cohesion potentially, and not even necessarily about search or learning or financial performance. Once you have all of these alternative things that you're trying to optimize on in the mix, can limit your ability to actually forge that more innovative.
Interesting. So personality really matters.
Yes. Yeah.
So how you play within those social groups,
Yeah.
and because co-investment networks look very different from geography
Yeah.
to geography,
Absolutely.
because they are interested in different things. I know for the summer when I was working in VC, the networks of VCs that we were placed under, they were very vocal and focused around social impact, right? So if you came in as a VC that doesn't care about any of those two things, then it gets hard to enter into the social dynamics of the
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. And so, yeah, I think you want to make sure that there's a shared sense of purpose, but I think also you want to take an inventory, right? Say, okay, how many connections do I have that have this demographic background versus that demographic? And if you see that you're just all in this one category, then it's time to think outside of the box a little bit, try to diversify that. That way you can make sure that you have that robust, balanced network that is going to be able to fill out any task that you might need to be able to solve.
So I'm so glad that we're on the topic of diversification.
Yeah.
Because that ties into the last.
Excellent. This is great.
Yeah, this is awesome. It ties into the last paper that I saw of yours that I thought was fascinating. It's titled Venturing with Caution, Insights into the Investment Strategy of Venture Capital Firms, which essentially says what we've been discussing
That's right.
somewhat. But I want to give you my one sentence summary
Yeah.
and then explain it a little bit more in detail, because I think this one is very interesting in terms of those specific types of diversification that each VC firm does according to their status. The abstract, or from what I got from the abstract, was that diversification versus specialization isn't just about risk or skill. It's socially influenced by how others perceive a firm and the strategic options that status unlocks.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So this paper, it's all about network application. And so the idea is that building out a more robust network that has more diverse kinds of experience within that network increases your ability to take on a wider variety of potential opportunities. Because when it's time to engage in that opportunity, you're going to be able to find, this is the perfect person to partner with for this strategy. They have great experience in this area. I could give them a call, activate my network, and then we can pursue this project and become successful with one another. And so what we find in the study is that it's these high status organizations that have usually a much richer, more kind of bridging set of social capital that has that more diverse experience background in terms of potential partners in it, to which allows them a kind of greater opportunity space, where if they see a deal that maybe looks promising, but I don't necessarily have my own experience to diversify into this area because it's not my background, they know the right person to call at any given time to pursue this project. And then since they're a high status reliable person, they're able to partner with that person, they work together, and then the deal is subsequently more successful because of this complementary expertise that they're able to pool together when they're working together.
And that high status, for example, a high status VC firm has a lot more credibility when reaching out to gain new experts,
That's
right?
exactly right. Because they're demonstrating their commitment to the project, that they're going to be a reliable partner, and that they've been able to coordinate this type of expertise, to coordinate this type of co-investment and working together
Hmm.
relationship in the past.
Yeah. What about mid-sized firms? So firms that not in terms of assets under management, but
Mhm.
in terms of reputation within the space, I can't even name a
Yeah.
middle of the road
So
VC.
I think what ends up happening is that there's a trajectory that helps firms build out their reputation to build status. And often they actually have to start by not diversifying. So they have to remain very concentrated into one single industry, build up a huge depth of expertise in that industry to demonstrate to other potential co-investors that they're serious, they're skilled and competent, and that working with them is going to lead more likely to success.
Mhm.
Building out that expertise also makes them more attractive partners to higher status firms that are looking to diversify
Mhm.
and then build out the expertise. And so working with those higher status firms then allows them to increase their own status. Now, once they get to a position when they're higher status, it's almost reversed, where they now have the opportunity, since they've demonstrated in their home category that they are the experts, when they want to branch out, they can start to branch out to those other kind of mid-level, more specialized
Mhm.
organizations to say, hey, let's work together. This would be great. Maybe I can do you a favor at some point down the road too. And again, I'm a high status, credible partner, and we're going to make this deal successful. And then they almost give back and raise those other firms to being
Mhm.
high status by working with them as well. So it's
Interesting.
this kind of dynamic process where you're building out expertise, then you're bridging to get complementary expertise in other industries as you diversify, as you move through the status hierarchy.
So, talk about that status hierarchy. What is the thing? What are some of the variables that play into increasing your status within the VC hierarchy?
It's a couple things. So I think it's demonstrating a track record of success, sure. Having industry expertise so that you're the go-to person in a
Mhm.
particular domain. It's also working with other very well-connected people. So if they see you working with Andreessen Horowitz and
Mhm.
Greylock and everything, okay, this guy must be serious. If he's working with
Yeah.
these very kind of high status Silicon Valley venture capital partners, there's also status by affiliation
Mm.
in that sense. And there's also status by taking on leadership roles. So if I have a demonstrated track record of being the lead on an investment,
Mm.
taking the initiative to actually source the deal, to provide the most strategic advice to the managers of the startups, and I'm able to do this successfully, that's also going to build up more trust in among my peers that I'm a competent partner and I'm willing to do the work to commit to making this investment successful for everyone. So I think it's a combination
Yeah.
of a variety of factors, but at the end of the day, it's really about demonstrating this almost intangible set of skills that provide trust and confidence among peers that I'm a great partner. I'm going to be credible in leading an investment to a success.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I've actually enjoyed quite a bit hearing you talk about your research.
Yeah.
We're gonna wrap up right
Okay.
now. It went by incredibly fast, but we're at 30 minutes. I told you it was gonna be 30 minutes.
I
Um,
enjoyed this.
but thank you so much for sharing your brain with us,
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime.
whoever us is. But before I wrap up, I do wanna ask you if you could summarize all of your research, or at least the ones that we've been discussing
Sure.
today, as what's the key finding or the common thread amongst all of these. What would you say it is?
I would say that clearly networks are important, right? And so is social capital to helping you achieve your goals. But if we talked about, we also don't want it to be a limiting factor. So we don't want to only say, again, invest in or pursue opportunities that are really close and familiar with us that are provided by our network. There is a huge benefit to actually going out, forging out a more diverse set of social capital, a more diverse set of strategic opportunities that's going to require getting outside of one's comfort zone. But building out those ties is incredibly valuable. And in the long run, it's going to provide a much greater range of opportunities to take advantage of and make us more successful and higher status in the long run as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Really
my
appreciate
pleasure.
it.
Thank you.
All right.